The ship groaned once. Just once. Like something alive finally admitting it had lost. Then the ice closed around it completely. Slowly, without mercy, without any sound dramatic enough to match what it meant. And Ernest Shackleton stood on the frozen surface of the Weddell Sea and watched 22 months of planning and 14 months of surviving get crushed into nothing by frozen water. 28 men stood behind him in the Antarctic dark. No rescue coming. No radio strong enough to reach anyone who could help. No land for hundreds of miles in any direction. Just white. Just cold. Just the particular silence that lives at the bottom of the earth where the wind never fully stops and the sun disappears for months at a time. One of the men, a quiet sailor named McNeish, older than most, not given to sentiment, stood at the edge of the group and said nothing. But his lips were moving. Not to anyone standing near him. Not to Shackleton. Something else entirely. Something he hadn't done since he was a boy in a cold Scottish church with his grandmother's hand on his shoulder. And whatever he said in that moment, whatever he asked or remembered or simply felt, something shifted. Not in the ice. Not in the situation. In him. That shift is the reason all 28 men came home. This is how it happened. It had started with an advertisement so honest it was almost insane. Shackleton placed it in a London newspaper in 1914. Some historians debate whether he actually wrote it, but the spirit of it was entirely his. Men wanted for hazardous journey. Low wages. Bitter cold. Long months of complete darkness. Constant danger. Safe return doubtful. The response was enormous. Thousands applied. He chose 27. Together with Shackleton, 28 men boarded the Endurance in London and sailed south toward a goal that had never been accomplished, crossing the entire Antarctic continent on foot. Over 1,800 miles of the most hostile terrain on Earth. The early weeks felt almost manageable. The Endurance was a strong ship, purpose-built for polar conditions, and the crew was experienced and capable. Shackleton ran a tight operation, but not a joyless one. He believed, genuinely, practically believed, that morale was as essential as food. Men played cards, sang songs, argued about football. The Antarctic showed them its beauty before it showed them its teeth. Vast blue-white silence, icebergs the size of cathedrals, skies that turned colors no painter would dare invent. Then the Weddell Sea did what the Weddell Sea does. In January 1915, the pack ice closed. Not dramatically. Not all at once. It moved in the way that truly dangerous things often move. Gradually, quietly, politely almost, until the moment you realize you cannot go forward or back or sideways and the situation has been decided without your input. The Endurance stopped. Locked in place. Going nowhere. They waited. Weeks became months. Winter came to the Antarctic and brought darkness with it. The kind of darkness that isn't just the absence of light but feels like a presence of its own. The temperature dropped past anything the men had experienced. The ship held, but the ice held tighter. By October 1915, the pressure had become unbearable. For the ship, not just the men. The ice wasn't just holding the Endurance anymore. It was squeezing. The hull groaned. Beams cracked. Water began coming in faster than pumps could manage. Shackleton gave the order nobody wanted to hear. Abandon ship. They came off the Endurance with what they could carry. 3 small lifeboats, tents, sleeping bags, food for a limited time, and camped on the ice and watched their ship die. It took several weeks. The Endurance went down slowly, bow first, on November 21, 1915, into 3,000 meters of black Antarctic water. McNeish watched it go. He was 50 years old, the oldest man in the group, a ship's carpenter who had built his life around the sea. Watching a ship sink is not something a sailor ever fully comes back from. He turned away before it was completely gone. Some things you don't need to see the end of. Shackleton gathered the men immediately. No time for grief. They were now camped on a floating ice sheet in the Weddell Sea, 500 miles from the nearest land, with 3 small boats and supplies that would last approximately 3 months. He told them the situation plainly. He always told them plainly. The plan had changed. The expedition was over. Getting home was the expedition now. They called it Ocean Camp. They dragged supplies from the ship before it went down, organized everything with military precision, rationed food with a specific calculation of men who understand that mathematics and survival are the same thing in conditions like these. Shackleton walked through the camp every day, not performing confidence, actually maintaining it, which is a completely different thing. But the ice was drifting, and not toward land. Months passed on the ice. The cold went past uncomfortable, past painful, into the specific numb territory where the body stops registering temperature as a sensation and starts registering it as a fact of existence. Men slept in bags that were never fully dry. Clothing that froze solid at night had to be put on frozen in the morning. Frostbite visited and sometimes stayed. Food was carefully portioned, carefully consumed, never enough to feel full but calculated to be enough to keep functioning. McNeish worked constantly. He repaired the boats, reinforced them, made them more seaworthy against odds that would have stopped a younger or less stubborn man. He didn't talk much. He was not the warm type, not the singing around the campfire type. He worked. That was his contribution, and he made it without sentiment. One night in the tent, when the wind was doing something outside that sounded less like weather and more like intention, he lay awake and thought about Psalm 139. He hadn't read it in decades, didn't have a Bible with him. No one did, not really. But his grandmother had made him memorize it at 7 years old in that cold Scottish church, and the words were still there. The way things are still there that got put in early enough. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. He'd thought that was a comforting idea when he was 7. Lying on Antarctic ice 500 miles from the nearest human being outside their little camp, he thought something different. He thought, if that's true, then there is no place remote enough, no situation abandoned enough, no darkness deep enough to be actually alone in. Not fully. Not completely. He didn't tell anyone. Men like McNeish don't announce things like that. He just got up the next morning and went back to work on the boats. April 1916. The ice finally broke up enough to launch. They got the 3 boats into open water and began rowing toward land, specifically Elephant Island, 200 miles away, the first actual land any of them had stood on in nearly 500 days. The Southern Ocean in April is not the ocean of travel brochures and postcards. It is cold beyond reason, violent beyond prediction, enormous in the specific way that makes a small boat feel like an apology. They rowed and sailed for 7 days. The sea did everything it could. Waves that came from directions that didn't make sense. Ice floes that appeared in the dark and had to be navigated by feel. Men bailing water constantly with whatever was available. Frostbite advancing on hands that couldn't stop moving because stopping meant dying. 2 men became so hypothermic they couldn't function and had to be kept alive by the body heat of the men crammed against them. McNeish's hands stopped working properly on day 4. He kept working anyway. You don't get to stop being the carpenter just because your hands have decided they're done. He bound them tighter, wedged tools against his palms differently, and kept going. Shackleton checked on him twice. McNeish said he was fine both times. He was not fine. He was functioning, which in those conditions is the same thing. They reached Elephant Island on April 15, 1916. When the boat scraped onto the beach, men fell out into the shallow water and some of them just stayed there, lying in the freezing surf, laughing. Not happy laughing. The laughing of people who have been holding something enormous for so long that when they can finally put it down their whole body responds before their mind catches up. It was land. It was real, solid, unmoving land. For the first time in nearly 500 days. But Elephant Island was uninhabited. No one knew they were there. No rescue was coming because no one knew to send one. Shackleton looked at the island, looked at the men, looked at the one remaining lifeboat that McNeish had reinforced across 7 days of open ocean, and made a decision that most people, hearing it described afterward, struggled to believe was made by a sane man in full possession of his reasoning. He would take 5 men and sail 800 miles through the Drake Passage, the most dangerous stretch of ocean on Earth, to South Georgia Island, where a whaling station could send help. 800 miles. In a 22-foot lifeboat. Through the Southern Ocean in winter. McNeish was one of the 5 chosen. He was 50 years old with hands that were still recovering from the previous crossing. Shackleton chose him anyway because the boat would need maintaining, and there was no one alive who knew that boat better than the man who had rebuilt it. They left on April 24, 1916. The 22 men remaining on Elephant Island watched the boat go, and then turned and faced the island and the weight. The 16 days that followed broke things in McNeish that he never fully talked about afterward. The Drake Passage is not a place the mind easily makes sense of. Waves that ran 60 feet. Wind that made communication impossible. Navigation done by dead reckoning because the sky rarely cleared enough for proper reading. The boat was perpetually swamped. Men bailed constantly, in shifts, without stopping. Sleep was measured in minutes. Food was cold. Everything was wet. Everything was always wet. On day 14, in a brief clear window, the navigator Worsley got a sun sight. South Georgia was there. 100 miles. They were going to make it. They hit South Georgia on day 16. Wrong side of the island. The whaling station was on the other side, separated by a mountain range that had never been crossed. Shackleton, Worsley, and one other man crossed it anyway. 36 hours of climbing through unmapped mountains with no proper equipment, driven by the specific and overwhelming fact that 25 men were waiting on an island and time was not a resource they had in surplus. They walked into the whaling station at Stromness on May 20, 1916. 3 men who looked like they had come from somewhere the living weren't supposed to come back from. The station manager, a man named Sorrell, reportedly did not recognize Shackleton at first. He had known him before the expedition. He looked at the 3 figures standing at his door and asked who they were. Shackleton said, "I am Ernest Shackleton." Sorrell turned away and wept. The rescue of the 22 men on Elephant Island took 4 attempts and 3.5 months. Ice conditions blocked the first 3 tries. On August 30, 1916, Shackleton reached them on a Chilean vessel called the Yelcho. All 22 were alive. All 28 men who had entered the ice returned from it. McNeish stood on the Yelcho's deck as Elephant Island shrank behind them and thought about that line again. The one his grandmother had put inside him 60 years earlier in a cold Scottish church. He understood it differently now than he had understood it at 7. Differently than he had understood it lying on the ice in the dark. Differently than he had understood it on the Drake Passage when the waves were 60 feet and the boat felt like a suggestion. Where can I flee from your presence? Nowhere. Not even there. Not even the bottom of the earth. Not the frozen sea. Not the unmapped mountains. Not the endless waiting on an island that nobody knew existed. Not any of it. He had gone as far as a man can go from the known world, and something had followed him all the way to the edge and waited there with him. He didn't preach about it. He never talked about it much at all. He was McNeish. That wasn't his way. But he knew what he knew, the way a man knows the things that get confirmed not by argument but by endurance. All 28 came home. Not because it was easy. Not because the ocean went gentle or the ice went soft or the mountains got shorter or the cold decided to make an exception. They came home because 28 men chose, every single day, through every single impossible thing, to keep choosing the next step. And because somewhere at the very bottom of the earth, in the places where human beings had no business surviving, something refused to let them be forgotten.